Hi, everyone, and welcome to our maybe final re-recording of Weird But True Fish Lore, how fish lore tells its own stories. This was a panel that Em and I gave at Gateway Fate in mid-October in St. Louis, and because it wasn't streamed, we didn't have a recording of it, but thanks to the wonderful people at Gateway Fate, they were like, yeah, sure, you can totally just re-record it and upload it. We don't care. And so you can find information about Gateway Fate on the VOD in the description below, but for now, uh, just Google it. Okay, so let's get started. Technically, since we're not in an auditorium, you probably don't need the QR code, but if you ever want to, for whatever reason, look at these slides themselves, you can scan this QR code or you can go to this URL and you'll be able to go to those. I will keep these slides up for a while. I think I even have last year's slides still up. And you can just kind of just look at it when you feel like it. So, if I can get to the right monitor. All right, so who the heck are we? Oh, that's cute how that lined up. Didn't plan that.
Adorable.
My name is Fruity Snacks. I am a Fisher main in Final Fantasy XIV. It's one of the primary things that I do in game. It's also one of the things that I am almost exclusively known for, with the exception of that one weird Chocobo Porter thing that we won't talk about. But joined with me today is M. M, introduce yourself.
Hello. I am Emanarum. M for short, that works just fine. I am the Loremaster for today's panel. I do a lot in the Final Fantasy community. I help with world races, I do cosplay, I do lore resources, but most relevant today is Fruity and I talk a lot about fish lore and the grander implications that has for the world. And we wanted to share some of those ideas with you all.
And it's going to be great.
Yeah.
So I just had to double check and make sure I wasn't muted because I've done that before. Just as a heads up for those of you who are watching this and are not, maybe just new to the game or are not at the end, we will be talking about spoilers of various sizes, but I promise that they will be cool spoilers and nothing directly related to the MSQ itself a ton, but there will be some. Definitely going to be a ton of spoilers here, so just keep an eye out on that. Fair warning, there beyond here there are monsters. Okay, so one of the things that I always like to do with my panels is I like to do like a rapid fire, like quick little like jump into whatever it is that we're talking about. And so we're gonna do some really weird fish lore. This is just a bunch of fun stuff that I have come up with, that I have found that is in no, they're not really related in any way. They're just fun. So Tiny Axolotl, aww. Tiny Axolotl was the first catchable axolotl added to the game back in Heaven's Ward, and it was caught in the Papyrus tree in As is Law, as we were talking about. And one of the fun things though is we don't see an axolotl again in like as catchable until, well, Dawn Trail technically, but we don't really see axolotls come back until that scene in Elpis with Meteon, and they're staring up at these cute little axolotls. And this axolotl and that scene actually created this was one of the first connections between Az's Law and Elpis being basically the same thing in different timelines. Mainly because they were both managed by Hermes, which was kind of fun. But that was also just something kind of weird and cool. For those of you who are like, well, technically there was axolotls and Shadowbringers. It ain't about them. We're talking about the source, not the first. But you could catch the Shade Axolotl in Long Mirror Lake in Ilmeg, but technically that Ilmeg was actually based on, I think, Corthus, so technically not really relevant here in that case, but it ain't about them. The next one is Furcicata. Furcicata is a fish that was in Elpis. It's caught in a Lethe. It was the ancients' way of seeing could we grow cutlery. I mean, you've heard of a knife fish. Here's a fork fish. Um, it didn't, maybe unsurprisingly, didn't pan out. No one really liked it. It kind of just didn't work, and so it ended up in Leith. Which, if you know anything about Leith, the area in Elpis, it's actually kind of like the graveyard of experimentation. And so for Kakata is one of those experiments that just didn't work because what a surprise. People don't want to use fish bones for, cutlery. The next one, and this is actually a newer fish added in patch 7.3. I think I actually once said that this was in 7.4 during the panel, and we don't have 7.4 at the time of recording. This is patch 7.3. Azure Diver. This one's a bit of a fun one because we all know our good friend Stinian loves his squid, and this one fish tells a very interesting story about how a spear wielding stranger tried to catch it and lost. How this one little squid absolutely just trounced this quote unquote stranger who is totally not a Stinian and totally just wrecked him. So that's a bit of a fun one, and they still, even in the newer fish that we're getting, they still have a lot of fun with these stories. Okay, so now that we're out of the rapid fire, I want to start talking about something a little bit bigger, which is a calamity, and it seems fitting that for a panel about fish lore, it would make sense that we open the more broader topics to the sixth Umbral Calamity, the Calamity of Water. So, what was the sixth Umbral Calamity, Em?
So the sixth Umbral Calamity was essentially a biblical flood. Each calamity up until this point, and including this one, was aspected with some sort of ether, and this one happened to be water. This is a small side tangent, but I always love to share that there are actually doubters across Eorzea that believe that the seventh calamity wasn't actually a calamity because there wasn't an aspect to it. Which is deeply entertaining to me because what do you mean you don't think that's a calamity? But the fact that all of the previous ones were aspected is why that kind of myth exists. The reason that the sixth Umbral Calamity was a water aspect, the folklore states that the spirits that reside within the Black Shroud were having enough of the War of the Magi. They were kind of done with it. So they called upon a flood to literally wash away the evidence of that war and also wash away those who were perpetuating it. So there weren't really supposed to be a lot of survivors to this, and we'll get into how civilization continued after this fact. I do want to point out, though, that this is also the city of Nim that we're kind of seeing a little bit of a visual for on this slide. It's not called the floating city of Nim because it's floating in the sky. It's called the floating city of Nim because it used to float on water. And then at some point towards the end of the fifth astral era or the start of the sixth Umbral Calamity, it started floating in the sky. So it's still a floating city. But it did used to be floating on the water.
And it just, the water levels rose, and the whole city was just kind of like, we kind of like this. And then the water came down, and it was just like, no. The city, we're going to keep it up.
Are you proposing that when the flood happened, the city rose with it, and then when the water levels went back down, the city just decided to stay there?
Yeah, why not?
That's speculation, but you know what? I'll accept it because it's decided funny. Thank you.
It just decided to stay.
Hey, that's grand.
Maybe they liked it up there. Maybe it was like, the view's better.
You know what? Can't argue with that. But the point being,
sentient cities.
Flood. Yeah.
Yeah. And when giant floods come around, people have to move. And so where did people end up going? And the answer was, well, a lot of places. I think what the Lalafell Magi or something like that. The Magi went up Mount Goromo, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, in Vilbrand. But the Makote went to Gurbania and basically established Gurabanya and Ragar's Reach. And they were. Is there anything else that we wanted to chat about? Movement? I think that was it before I moved on.
As far as this goes, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Because the previous calamity was a lot of migration to Eorzea itself, because that's when the seas froze, and a lot of peoples kind of crossed land masses. That was the first huge, like, push for civilization, kind of getting a grounded foundation in Eorzea. And then we ended up with the War of the Magi, and the flood of the sixth calamity followed that. And people had to kind of become diasporic again, moving to high ground to find safety and building there.
Yes, and we're gonna come back to the Six Umbral Calamity and its aftermath, and how people moved and all that in a little bit. But first, we're gonna talk about the Comet, which was coinciding with the Six Umbral Calamity, and basically, you may have heard it referred to this as Ralgar's Comet. This was a large comet that, I have speaker notes. I should use them. This was basically just like a large comet that at the end of the Fifth Astral Era, it came up and led people to safety. They were able, they saw the star and they're like, oh, it's a sign. And they would follow it. And they did. And that's how a lot of Gurabanya was set. And that's why Ralgar is, associated with Gurabanya and all that stuff. It's all great, cool, fun. But one of the interesting impacts that we have, and we see this with fish, is the impact of the comet on the world. It wasn't just a sign. It wasn't just something that people saw and was like, ooh, it's a sign, we should follow it. No, actually, we learn from various places in Gurabanya, including a fishing hole, the comet's tail. We learned that the star actually had an impact on the land itself. And so, like, the comet's tail is this glowing cave in the fringes. I had to get that right. And one of the things that you learn about it is it didn't always glow. It started to glow when the comet passed. And so we're like, okay, cool. Well, did any of the fish tell this story as well? Like, was there impact on the ecology in any way? And ironically enough, none of the fish tell the story about like the comet doing anything in the comet's tail itself. That's if you're a big fisher, you know that the comet's tail is where bishop fish and cardinal fish and the archbishop are, along with a couple of cool little snails like bone melter. But nothing actually calls things out. So we have to look a little bit different into, a couple of different places, and we find fish that do end up saying, like, hey, there was an impact here, and it was impact as in like not like a physical impact. I should be a little clear on that. But like we have a fish in the comet's tail, which I thought this was another fish on the slide. It's been a few weeks, pardon me. But like Falling Star, it talks about how it started to glow after Ragar's comet went and went past. And so we see in the fish lore, like, oh, not only are we hearing about the Six Umbral Calamity and then the star appearing, we're also seeing how that star and the Six Umbral Calamity impacted the world beyond just the people, but also the fauna, the flora, and all this other stuff. I'm sure if you looked into botany lore in 14, which people have, you would probably see similar stories being told.
And part of the fun thing of this is that this means that the story about Ralgar literally throwing a star across the sky in order to guide people to higher ground to avoid the floods of the calamity. It's not just folklore, it's not just a myth. There is a physical like several pieces of physical evidence that this was actually something that was going across the sky. And it was large enough that people from all over could see it and follow it, which means it was also large enough to leave a physical impact, which is kind of where we're going next.
Except we don't know where.
Yeah, we don't know
we
where.
don't.
So there's this beautiful like paint drawing that Fruity initially sent me at like 2 a.m.
Yeah, I sent this to you like super early in the morning. I don't know if it was late. Oh, I thought I turned those off. Sorry for those who are watching the VOD. I totally have Twitch alerts on, and I'm going to turn those off now. Anyways, back on track. The thing that we don't have is the impact site. If there even is one, if you know anything about comets, you know that comets typically do not impact anything. They're super far out. They're just really sometimes bright in the sky. There is, though, indications that it was close enough that there was, maybe stuff falling off of it. Like, it is close enough that it could have impacted. So we're like, well, where did it end up going? And we see a little bit of this in the Blood Brine Sea, which is like the opposite end of the continent. With the fish, the Star of the Destroyer, it's caught in ocean fishing, and it talks about how this was a fish that was created due to parts of the star falling off into the water. So it's like, okay, well, there's a big enough thing, and there's obviously someone saying stuff is falling into the water, which is how all myths start, is with some grain of truth. We're like, okay, well, where did it end up? And we don't know. There's no huge impact crater anywhere that we have found. But with Dawn Trail, there is the giant rift between the two continents of, north of Tulilolol and between Yaktaral and Shaktaral. And there are some crater pockmarks in northern Shaktaral, which is a thing. Did I get those backwards? No, I didn't get those backwards.
You got there. Yeah, you got it. Another thing of note is also that part of this comet's path does kind of have it flying over Shade's Triangle, which we don't know too much about yet, other than the fact that it's a snapshot of the astral era immediately preceding the sixth Umbral Calamity. So there is a certain kind of historical connection between why this comet exists and the civilizations that exist in the Shades Triangle. I can't tell you for sure at this time if there is something tangible to do with it, but given the fact that the comet simply flying overhead or chunks of it falling off also had like a huge ecological impact on the land, I wouldn't put it out of the question that Shades Triangle may also have been impacted by this. We do also have someone in chat saying, if it's called a comet, does it not stand to reason that it didn't hit the star, but like Halley's, it just flew off?
Yes.
Technically, yes.
Yes.
But the fact that we have chunks that have landed and pockmarked the land and haven't simply burned up in atmosphere means that there is something tangible in atmosphere as well.
Typically,
there would still be more.
Yeah, comets, pulling away from marine biology and lore here and talking about astrophysics, my other focus. Comets typically don't get close enough to a surface to be able to do that. At that point, you're looking at a meteorite or a bolide. And at that point, if it's close enough to be in the atmosphere, it is likely coming down. Because the atmosphere of anything would start dragging. Just basically, it's a huge amount of friction, and it would just be dragging it, slowing it down, and pulling it in. So it is not confirmed that it hit. You are absolutely right that it could have overshot, and there are situations where that could have happened. But because we don't have any sort of impact crater, we don't know any story about it impacting, we don't know for sure. So we can't really say if it did or if it didn't, but we know that there was presumably it was close enough that parts of it fell off into the sky or out of the sky and hit the ground and if you follow that path, there is evidence of where that suspected path could have been. Um, there was evidence that stuff fell off of it. So yes, Comet probably doesn't usually hit, and if it does, it's a bad deal, bad time for everybody. But we just don't know in this case.
It's also worth noting that the myth behind this comet, and it is also referred to as a beam in some places,
And
is
itself.
that it was a sign sent from Rhalgr, one of the 12. And there's a lot to go into with who the 12 really are, and we'll dig into that a little bit today as well. But
Like really soon.
yeah, really soon. But Rhalgr feasibly does have the power to summon a giant rock and throw it across the sky and have that burn up in the atmosphere and have that be the thing that was visible while still, having chunks of it fly off and impact the land. Regardless, we know that this was a physical object that was large and close enough for people to see. Um, would I love to learn more about this in the future? Absolutely. But right now, we are trying to learn about it, the little clues and the archaeological hints that we get across the land as well.
Yeah. The other thing that came up too was the botanist and miner Wachumeki Meki quests. Talks about falling star fragments. I think what we decided that wasn't this, or it was something different, like the timeline was off.
It could be related. The timeline is a little in question, just because of where those things come from, because the lore inspiration from those are actually from Final Fantasy XI. There are certain connotations with putting those things in a region with a falling star. Uh, so I'm a little hesitant to connect it, but it is the same kind of descriptions that we've already talked about in terms of the, land and the fish being impacted by a celestial object.
Yeah. So, to kind of jump ahead a little, well, not really jump ahead, but to move ahead on this, we were talking about, you mentioned the Ralgar and what we learned about the 12. This is where, like, if we haven't touched spoilers yet, this is definitely a spoiler. We learned about the story of the 12 and what actually happens and what their actual true nature was, and so because of that, we're able to start mapping a little bit more reliably, like back to the quote unquote real world rather than the divine world. We can't just like magic hands everything. So I wanted to talk about one of my favorite fishing stories, which comes from her. This is Lemlian. We fight her in the third Myths of the 12, Myths of the Realm uh, Alliance raid. And with her, part of her fight, comes her two pets, Thalos and Pericos. And that's cool. And Thalos and Pericos are two of the serpents that are known associates. I guess that makes it sound like Lemlian's a criminal. But like basically, Pericos and Thalos are two of the like sub deities of Lemlian. And when the typically when Lemlian was introduced, it's in the creation myth with the addition of water. And I'm not going to read this out. I'm going to kind of just, say this paraphrasing. Basically, Lemlian shows up and goes, man, this place is dry as heck. We need water. So she created Pericos and Thalos, and I don't know how the mechanics of this work, but they just started throwing up everywhere, and it was just water coming out everywhere. And then they just kept doing that for a while, and then the water levels rose, and Lemlian's like, yeah, that's good enough. And then they stopped, and that's how we have the water. It's really kind of weird when you think about it that way. Uh, but that's kind of the story of how that got started. And at the end of this clip here from the creation myth, it says To ensure that no man could find the serpents, Thalos and Pericos, and use them for evil, she enchanted an island, making it wander the seas, and implying the island was wandering the seas. So that really begs the question: um, where the heck did Pericos and Thalos go? That is a question that has come up a few times in the world, and one of the places it came up is here in Upper Lenosha. This is marked on the map. It's it's the opposite side. It's the western side of Upper Lenosha is Thalos skeleton. That's what it is. And if you look in, down in the if I can get my right thing here. If you look at the um stop back. If you go back and you can do a quest in this little hut down here. There is a Lalafell who is like, I'm here to study this giant skeleton. I think it's Thalos. It's a really interesting quest to go through, and that's kind of neat, and totally worth doing. And it talks about how they actually think that this is the skeleton of one of Lemlian's serpents, specifically Thalos. And it's worth noting that in 1.0, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, Upper Lenosha did not have this skeleton. It wasn't as prominent. It was a little bit more hidden away. And then when 2.0 came out, this is what you ended up seeing was like, there's a giant Thalos skeleton here. And that is really interesting because they obviously like looked at that and were like, we need to make this more exposed and more interesting. So there was something there. That was kind of, that's kind of the whole crux of it is there is obviously something here that we need to know. And this was back in 2.0 and even before the Mists of the Realm, we were looking at this going, maybe if this is an actual Thalos skeleton, then maybe the gods weren't divine. Maybe they weren't gods themselves. And so that's what the Fishers have been skeptical, at least if you've known this story, you've been a little skeptical of this to begin with. So maybe that's where it is, but didn't she put them in, Swallowtail Rise, which is the name of the island that supposedly is holding Thalos and Pericos. And one thing that somebody pointed out was, well, if it was Swallowtail Rise, what about Seal Rock? When we first gave this panel, Em and I looked at that going, no, we don't know. That doesn't seem right because it's PvP lore. Who
and
knew?
It's also worth noting that the PvP lore itself, which Fruity quote a little bit more directly, that's an in-game myth as well, because
Yes.
nobody knows for sure. Same thing with the quest in Upper Lenosha. These are explanations that are being given from an in-universe perspective for things that we don't understand. Fruity and I have the benefit of not being NPCs, and we can kind of look at the game from a higher level as far as understanding how myths change over time. But none of this is like things that we know for certain. But it is true that it could just as well be PvP, though there is an easier explanation for that.
Yeah. When I looked into this was something that someone called out and was like, well, it says it in the lore, and technically they're right. It does actually say that Seal Rock was once considered to be Swallowtail Rise. This was, I think, what did I say? It was like end of Endwalker, not Endwalker. Whoa, end of A Realm Reborn into Heavensward. Seal Rock was thought to be, Swallowtail Rise, the resting place of Thalos and Pericos, and then we find out in Heavensward that they changed that thought and was like, no, we don't think that anymore, and they actually kind of more confirmed it to be the testing ground for the Omega frame. So once again, it's the Alligans.
Yeah, I was about to say, which means that Allagan experimentation was kind of the primary purpose of that location, and Alog was kind of famous for creating just biological monstrosities, largely inspired by myth, which would be a whole other panel. But there might be something loosely inspired by giant serpents in the Allegan region, though the 12 didn't really come to prominence until the start of the 5th era, and Alleg existed in the 3rd. So it could also be that a lot of the lore originally surrounding these large fish, calling them fish feels kind of demeaning, serpents, uh,
I mean,
that the folklore for
yeah.
them could have originated from Allegan experimentation, because it would not be the first, second, third, 10th, nth to the 100th power time that people have sought an explanation for Alog before understanding what Alog actually was.
Yeah. And it's also worth noting too that they were like, oh, this is where the serpents both were buried, but it was never actually confirmed that Swallowtail Rome, not Swallowtail Rise, I've been calling it wrong, but Swallowtail Rome, wherever it uh, is where one of the serpents may be sealed, but maybe not both. So who knows, what the hell is going on with Seal Rock? But we know that it isn't the resting place of Thalos and Pericos. And you're like, okay, well, did they even exist? Like, what's going on with them? Like, what is the vector for this? Because when you think about creation myth, and this was something that we talked about, back when we were doing this at Gateway, was folklore and how folklore kind of comes about. How do you think people who are going through these major events are processing and then telling the story of what they're seeing? And we can start piecing together the Thalos and Pericos story in Eastern Lenosha with Little Thalos and Little Pericos. These are two fish that you can catch in Eastern Lenosha, which is fun. Oddly enough, Little Pericos is actually added in Stormblood. I don't know if that does anything, despite being in a Realm Reborn zone. But we have these two fish, and they both call out that they are, quote unquote, little versions of Lemlian's, pets. And it's interesting that they start this really interesting line of breadcrumbs that you can follow. So little Thalos is caught, like in the Rotano Sea. It's basically Eastern Lenosha, but if you catch three of them, you get the intuition trigger for a fish called, well, the Nepto Dragon. Nepto Dragon is really interesting because it is strongly implied that Nepto Dragons only appear, and usually only one, will appear after calamities. Specifically after calamities. So if you're thinking like, okay, we're in the 6th Umbral Calamity. We're going back there, by the way. We're coming back to the start. With the 6th Umbral Calamity, what happens if the water calamity, which is just bringing a bunch of water aether into the world, and then you have a fish that is etherically sensitive and is water aspected, gets all that? Does it just become like this huge giant fish? Like, what could go wrong when you just mix all these things together? And so we have this really interesting idea of what happens if Nepto Dragon that shows up after calamities. If you do the Feast of Famine quest line, that is basically the big build up to what the end of that quest line is saying that Nepto Dragon only shows up after calamities because of the Aether and all that. And so what happens if we get a whole bunch of water aspected Aether into the system? And basically, is this just a giant Nepto Dragon? It was the big weird revelation that we've had of maybe Thalos and Pericos aren't actual, I mean, there obviously weren't deities. We learned that in Myths of the Realm, even though they are a deity alike. One of the things that we were thinking of before we even learned that was what happens if they're just giant nepto dragons. And when you think about the story of that creation myth and you put it into the lens of folklore, which is how these all start, um could it just be that, these people in Upper Lenosha during the Sixth Umbral Calamity would see this giant serpent as after all of this water just came up and just showed up. They see this giant serpent and they're just really starting to learn about the gods and follow them. Um, could they just be like, oh, that's a sign from our god? And so you have this interesting play of, or an interesting other avenue that you could go down, where instead of it just being like an actual fish, maybe it was an actual fish and just scared the crap out of somebody. I guess is the way to
It's
go with it. Yeah, I'm rambling on this a little bit.
no, but it's so important because it's such a human thing to seek explanations for things that we don't understand, especially when it scares us. And nothing could be more true than when it comes to creation myth. And this isn't going to turn into a whole theological thing, but we see that in like real life human history as well, with the original explanation for eclipses and like predictions of doomsdays, or like misunderstandings when going on archaeological digs and learning about civilizations long gone. There are all of these beautiful creation myths and pieces of folklore that were magical or godly explanations for what we now have scientific explanations for. And that's kind of the approach that we take on this panel, and kind of when we're talking about lore as it applies to ecological changes in world building in general. Because our understanding of the 12 is that they are people. At the end of the day, they are unsundered beings that Heidelin essentially tied the laws of physics to when she sundered the world so that they would continue to exist. But because they've been deified, there have kind of been projections onto them. We see the same thing with Dalamud becoming a pet after a certain amount of time with the Red Moon, because that belief became something a little bit more tangible to the gods. So the same thing could also possibly be true for Thalos and Perikos for Lemleyan, is that the human belief and the folklore that surrounds these deities, who aren't actually deities, they may also be influenced as well. So we are kind of taking a scientific ethereophysical approach to talking about these things, when the in-universe explanation for a very long time was magical, because that was what was understood.
And
And
this
I
is
hope that explanation was clear, because this is some very like high level
this is where we
stuff
have to
that
pull
we
out
can get into.
the like Pepe
Yeah.
Silva, you know, board and stuff. One of the things too, the to kind of tie to what you were just saying, is that we have scientific explanations for things now. One of the things that we do know is fish guide lore, basically the stuff that you see here. This is actually tied, or sorry, it's written in the style of a Charlian scholar. So it's written as if, a Charlian scholar went out, did research, got an answer, and wrote down like a little journal entry on what it was. So when you were looking at fish lore, we have to look at it from that lens and then apply the the other world views into what could have shaped that scientific answer. And so one of the things that you were saying is folklore can sway how people believe and perceive what is happening around them. And so that's just something to point out, is that this we that was kind of the tie that we were able to make of, oh, yeah, Nepto Dragon is obviously affected by Aether. Water Calamity comes in. That's water aspected Aether. We know that they respond to it, so it could have just grown to big epic proportions. Could that have really? Could this have just been a Nepto Dragon? And the story of Lemlian and Pericos and Thalos, uh, could that have just been folklore that started when people saw this in the distance and it had no actual, tie onto the rising waters itself?
You know, it's just hit me that what we're essentially doing is peer reviewing everything that Charlian has ever written from a meta perspective. And I think that's probably the best way to describe how you kind of have to look at in-universe written explanations for things, both fish lore and anything else in Final Fantasy XIV, because I talked a little bit about this with the calamities at the beginning. There are a certain subset of people that don't believe the seventh calamity was a calamity because there were only 6 like base elements and calamities had to be aspected. And I'm like, well, you've been provided new evidence that suggests otherwise, and you're still clinging to the old idea. Uh Granted, that turns into a little bit of a conspiracy theory territory when it comes to the calamities, but the idea of questioning previous knowledge now that you have new information, that's the heart of using fish lore to explain a little bit more about the world, which is super cool.
Yeah. A little side fun fact here as well. Little Thalos and Little Pericos are, if I go back a bit, um, they are depicted as oarfish. So these are real life fish that you can see. They're found in waters all across the world. And oarfish, in specifically Japanese folklore, using that word again, they were considered doomsday fish. So if you ever actually saw an oarfish, you would take that as a messenger from the gods that an earthquake or a tsunami was about to strike. Um, that is partially due to the fact that oarfish live deep, 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 deep in the water. And so they're very sensitive to seismic activity down there. And when they sense that movement happening, they start to rise up to the surface. So that was kind of the scientific mechanism for why this folklore or this legend of the doomsday fish, of the oarfish, got started, kind of tying that together. So, so okay, so we've talked about the 6 Umbral Calamity, we've talked about the Comet, we've talked about roaming islands. What happened after the 6th Umbral Calamity? And it's a very gripping tale of just, everything drying off. The water started to recede, and that leads us into 1.0.
Yeah, that's the 6th astral era. We've been talking about all of this history of the game that feels so far out of reach because it's just quote unquote side content, really, that we have to learn about retroactively. But these are the events that are literally immediately preceding the actual start of the game and the history that we are actively playing through. Granted, we don't start 1.0 at like the very beginning of the 6th astral era. It's actually right towards the end because, a 7th calamity ends up hitting, right? But this was the age of prosperity. This was the age of progress. This is the first time we have a calamity where a lot of the structures kind of still exist. Because the ideas of the 12 are still there, and we have civilizations that, they were completely destroyed, if not decimated, like Mahach and Nim and Amdapor, but we talked about Girabanya. The city-states have already kind of a small foundation, but they, rose to prominence. The brunt of the ecological impact ended up being between the Black Shroud area and Girabanya. By and large, though, civilization was able to kind of pick up again. That's not to say that there weren't a lot of changes, though, because as we've kind of hinted at, the calamity of water involved flooding almost the entire planet. There's no way that that doesn't displace fish. I would actually be shocked if every fish was still where it used to be, if that didn't happen. But this was an era of migration and kind of settling down, not just for civilizations, but for wildlife.
Yeah, and to go back, because someone brought it up in chat, so is the theory that the calamity led to the giant Nepto dragon, which led to people seeing them and associating them with Lemlian with the current water levels? That so far is correct. That is our assumption, is that, they saw the rising water levels, they saw the giant Nepto dragon, they were like, that must be the case. Um, that then was like the story that they ended up telling, and it morphed over time into the more modern age of being the creation myth and those serpents being associated with Lemlian because Lemlian was a god of water, or of the seas, excuse me. But
Correct. Yeah,
yeah,
the belief of the 12 carried over from the 5th astral era into the 6th.
yeah, and with the sixth astral era too, it's also noted that this was like the age of prosperity and age of progress, and the records of everything started to become a little bit more reliable. And so we were able to, in game, well, not even in game, in world, things became a little bit easier to follow, because there was more records for that. But one of the things that we did see with the end of the sixth astral, or this with the sixth astral era, was as the water levels dropped, fish ended up being in places that they weren't originally from. And we actually see this a fair bit, where there's a lot of similar fish in two different areas that are completely different. So we have the Dravanian squeaker and the capsize squeaker. These are both upside down catfish. And it's even called out in the capsize squeaker that it might have a relationship with the Dravanian squeaker, and how, okay, maybe these are the same things. How could that have happened? Oh, well, the whole world was covered in water, so they probably just moved around a bit or got forced to be moved around. And we're like, well, one fish doesn't say it. There's actually a second one, the Armorer and Cindersmith. And Cindersmith literally calls it out. Cindersmith says the metallic scales covering this lava-dwelling snail closely resemble those of the deep-sea snail known as the Armorer, leading naturalists to hypothesize that at one time sea levels were much higher, which we knew they were during the Sixth Umbral era, and that when the waters receded, snails left atop mountains began to evolve separately. It is literally Cindersmith that enables the theory of the marine biodiversity boom that happens after the Sixth Umbral era into the Sixth Astral era, because specifically of Cindersmith. If we didn't have Cindersmith, it would all be speculation. But because they're like, oh yeah, we think that that totally happened, we can now go, cool, it actually works. And we find out even more that some fish thrived. Cindersmith was deposited on top of a mountain that was a volcano, and it still somehow lived. And even fish like Garlicthus, which is already a very large fish if you catch it, was also deposited. And as the water levels dropped, some of them were left in Dravania, in Halo, in another volcano right next to Cindersmith. And so we can draw these parallels between fish. So that's how we know that Garlicthus and Problematicus are probably related, despite the fact that one is caught in Thavnair in the Perfumed Tides, and the other one is caught in an active volcano. So we have this really interesting parallel that we can draw now after the end of the Sixth Umbral era, and start looking at the world of it used to have this one view, or this one state where, all these fish were in this area, all these plants were in this area. And then the water levels rose and everything just got mixed up and then came back down. And so now we have a completely different ecological state, which was really fascinating. And it's always fun whenever a new fish comes up that we can point at and be like, oh, that's probably related to this fish in another area. Like I think I talked about in another one of my panels, which you can see on my YouTube channel right now. Um, we have the Zoger scorpion and the scorpion fly. They're basically the same fish, but they're both skyfish. So we're like, oh, maybe they were similar. Maybe they have a distant cousin somewhere on either side, and because of these calamities, they were able to move around. So,
It's what's so cool about this is that this isn't just science that we're pulling from like a completely random place, right? This is something called divergent evolution, where a certain type of fish or any other creature really uh evolves separately over time into different species because their environments change or they're now on different continents. In this case, completely different environments, right? We've got a sea fish that then becomes a magma fish, for lack of better explanation, because they adapt to survive. They evolve. This is an actual biological phenomena.
which was
Um,
well documented by Darwin. If you ever want to look up the Galapagos, and the Galapagos is like the exact thing that you would be seeing.
And this is also the same thing of this is how we learn about old, sometimes extinct species in real life as well. Like there are fish fossils that get found at the top of mountains. And the explanation for that also is, oh, there used to be a higher water level or there was a flood. And that also leads into, folklore and creation myths in real life. Uh, it's
I've been to
fun to see
Denver.
that yeah, it's
It's
fun to
like that
see
in
the
Denver.
ecological changes. Yeah.
Yeah, when I was in Denver, I for school, for when I was in college, we had a field trip to Denver, Colorado. It's a thing. But one of the things we did was we went up this mountain on a hike, and at the top of the mountain, they were like, "Hey, here's a bunch of dinosaur bones," and on the other side of the trail, here is a shoreline, a
Yep.
fossilized mangrove shoreline, and we're like, "Oh, we're like a mile and a half up right now. Was the water level high? No, it's just how things were." So we have a whole lot of really fun things that we can do and assume now with that because of just a few fish. We're like, okay, we can now paint these pictures. But moving on. So this next part. Uh, I'm going to preface this by saying this is when we start getting really, really kind of weird and is new to Em and I in our conversations. So yeah, do fish? I'm just gonna go to. We're just gonna go to the fish.
Yeah, we're
So
taking a
this,
sharp left turn.
yeah, so this son of a bitch, has caused so many weird conversations. The way that this description is worded, it is implied that they made endless fish in Proto Alexandria.
Yep.
And so I made this comment to to M, and I was like, "Hey, uh, do you think they could have made endless fish?" And it has literally, oh my god, we've had so many weird conversations about this now.
I need y'all to understand. The fun part about this is we're on a Discord call right now, so I can actually look it up when I got this. The message I got from Fruity was, I just found an endless fish. And my response was, I'm sorry, what? And then he waits a solid 30 minutes to send me a screenshot of this. And in the meantime, I'm having to sit there wrestling with the implications of a fish being endless, because that means that there's enough memory worth storing. And the fish may also have a soul, and it caused an entire existential crisis for the both of us, because that's a lot to take in. What do you mean I have to wrestle with this now?
And then like we were like, do feral souls count? Can you have an endless feral soul? Were they testing endlessness on fish? And it just became this weird conversation and exploration into Alexandria.
Yeah. This turned into a whole thing because the implication of this fish is not just that they were storing it, but the fact that they reconstituted it and maintained that reconstitution in the middle of what was essentially a power crisis. Why? Why are they doing that
Yeah.
to this poor carp? Uh,
And it's not even the only fish.
it's not even the only fish that like can be caught because this is a living memory fish, right?
Yeah, this is in
That
living
is where it's
memory.
caught.
And
Yeah.
as because one person pointed out, can after the story of 7.3, is it still there? Yes, it is. Which is, that might just be like hand wavy, like ooh magic.
It's an MMO. You got to have a certain level of like it's
Of
still there,
whimsy.
right? Same thing as like Amarot's still there, even though in the story it's kind of fading, right?
Um,
But the fact that it's here in the first place
yeah,
is a
the
lot
way that it
to
can be
process.
interpreted is really weird, but it led to this really wild pathway of, okay, what do the fish tell us about um what do the fish tell us about Alexandria? And we actually see a little bit of this if you look in other fish, especially in Proto Alexandria, which is a fishing hole that I guarantee you maybe one of you actually knew existed. And the rest of you who knew it existed probably forgot about it like me. Um, it is a weird fish, or it's a weird fishing hole. It's often the amusement park area. Anyways, one of those other fish is Scarlet Queen. This talks about how, this was a selectively bred fish species that was given to like the royal family. We see that relationship of cultures, at least, in Ul'dah and in Lenosha and on Vilbrand, and I think even Gridania. Everybody used fish as a form of like a present or a gift or some form of status. Uh, you have like goldfish, bronzefish in Ul'dah. At one point, I think people were saying like, I think one of them even talks about how they were used as currency in some cases. Um, it's very much a yeah. As someone else is pointing out, Garlemald with Sovereign Shadow, which is a beta fish. I think the one thing that's interesting is Scarlet Queen, and I'm just noticing this now. Scarlet Queen isn't a beta or a goldfish, which are in real life have been typically considered prized fish like that. Like we would see that with koi, we would see that with betas, and some goldfish are very highly valued and would be used as gifts. This is a fish that isn't one of those species, so it's kind of weird to see it that way, but it is still interesting because that parallel is still there. And we also learn from fish, a very similar looking fish, that there is, we get a little bit of an idea of what the insight of living in living memory and in proto or in Alexandria was like. Something that I know I never noticed was fish apparently, or not fish. Um, there's no natural night sky. It never crossed my mind because you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, and you just make this assumption that there is, a night sky and that they would have simulated that or something. There is no natural night sky, so people didn't have stars, but they had fish, so they would look at the fish, and that would be cool. But it was also like, why? Ooh, um, and so we had this idea. So it just gives us these like little bits, and with the canal bream, we have like a little bit of what did they like to eat? What were some of the food that they like to have? In this case, it was bream, which was a popular source of food, even though you couldn't eat it in living memory because it didn't. I mean, you could, but then it didn't taste like anything. That was weird. But anyways, it tells like this, this fun little story about how canal breams are this popular type of fish that people would buy, and chefs would hate it because it has such a huge eye. Um, I mean, seriously, look at that thing. It is like literally looking down on you, like pathetic, and just but yeah,
I was gonna say there's so much world building if you can go back to the previous slide on this as well, because it's not just fish that we're learning about here, right? We're using fish to learn more about the implied like world building that we get from this. For living memory in particular, a huge portion of what we're doing in the story there is shutting down the simulations of the region and kind of leaving behind, for lack of a better term, the like blank hardware, right? That's kind of what we do in the 7.0 MSQ.
yeah,
There's still something physical underlying there, right? That's kind of how it works.
yeah.
But what that implies about the sky is that we can't learn anything from it, which is really frustrating from the perspective of a lore expert, because we're still kind of trying to figure out which shard that we're accessing. Because we know which shard Alexandria originally comes from, right? It's the ninth. Uh, we don't know where living memory currently exists. Because prior to the events of Dawn Trail, there is also a chance that they have harvested ether and souls like this in other places. Doesn't confirm one way or another. How much of living memory that we've accessed is even on a shard that we are familiar with, right? Is it domed in? I would love to learn more about that. But what's the is it Gibel? Gibel? I don't even
Yeah,
pronounce
Jibel or
it.
Gibel, one of the two.
Gibel. Yeah, sure. One of those.
You
But
pronounced
this is
mock funny earlier, so I'm just gonna let you
Mah
pronounce it more.
is
Mock.
I'm pronouncing it correctly.
I always just pronounce it mock.
Mach.
Mock.
Either way works. It's one of those where, like, if you're familiar with the linguistic origin, that's a whole other conversation about linguistics that we don't need to dig into today. So there's a certain, like, physical aspect of understanding the world and the physics of the world that these fish also continue to say, hey, there's more here that you should be digging into. But the other aspect of this is cultural, right? Like we've seen fish as gift giving items be very, very relevant in a few civilizations in Eorzea. But what these fish tell us about Alexandria is that this was like a huge thing. So maybe that's one of the reasons that they decided to have an endless fish to see if it was possible. Uh, but also, why are you doing that to a fish? Because the canal bream isn't implied to be endless. It can be, but it could also be a fish that has survived everything that is going on and just still exists in actual water of this region, because we know that not everything is a simulation. There still has to be a physical place that sets this up. So we get a lot of answers from these fish, but they also, bring about a whole lot more questions. So there's a net gain and a net gain in questions.
Yeah, and it. I don't know. It's even if the ultimate carp, if we go back, even if this guy isn't actually an endless fish, which let's be honest, there's a probably a good chance it's not. Um, it is an interesting interpretation of the lore that led to people looking, people being, me and M, looking at this and going, well, what else can we learn about this with the fish, and really starting to dig into, you know, the lore of the world. And it's Final Fantasy XIV is one of the most interesting games with its lore, because it will look at something as innocuous as fishing and go, yeah, that's a vector for storytelling. We can do that. It is so interesting, um, and very unique. And I find it very interesting how they use fish to, not just draw parallels between cultures, but also tell stories about what's happening in those cultures. Um, I just think that that's very unique and something that everyone should really look into and try out whenever you get a chance. Um, or else this guy's gonna look down on you and just be like pathetic. Um, But yeah, so do you have anything else you want to add to this, M, before we move on to our question section? For those of you who have questions, please put them into chat and the delay will time this correctly.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much else to add as far as what we've covered today. I do just to add on to what you were just saying about fish lore. You and I have often marveled at the fact that this is optional content, and yet we learn so much that we consider important about the world through said optional content. It's entirely possible to play through the MSQ and be completely satisfied with that, and that's totally valid. Uh, the fun part about this is it puts us in the position of the researchers, right? It puts us in an archival position where we're asking more about the world and we're getting more context for the main story and for more of the linear side content like quests and stuff. It's so fun that this is additive lore. Like there's always something to learn, and while I may not be doing a lot of the fishing myself, I love getting the random, "Hey, look at this fish" in the middle of the night. Because it's more for me to learn as well. So
I think,
it's just a testament to how well this content is created, that there's something here for everybody.
yeah. So if you have any questions, we'll wait for the stream delay to come through. But if you have any questions, you can just ask them and about, anything about fishing, the lore, what we talked about, stuff like that. But I think if you are watching this either now as we're doing it or live or, on one of the VODs in the future, I would encourage you to, even if you're not interested in fishing, give yourself like an hour, unlock it if you haven't, and just go and explore the world, looking for fishing holes and just seeing what's there, and then reading their guide entry and looking around where that fishing hole was and see what story it's trying to fill. Like, what is it telling something about? I'm thinking of like Princess Trout, which is in Middle Enosha, I think, near Summerford. Like, that whole area has a few fish that tells the area. It tells about, tells about Limsa and that specific zone. Um, but I highly recommend, just give yourself an hour. You can tolerate fishing for an hour. Um, just go do that and, see what fish you find and see what lore and find what little short stories there are. Because there are over 1,700 of these little short stories in the game, and they are all interesting and funny or dramatic or whimsy.
It's I would also, to piggyback off of that, encourage everyone to kind of look at lore in general through this sort of lens, because it is a fun puzzle to put together. And in-game narrators, while trustworthy, may not always be reliable because they don't have the benefit of being like a person playing the game from a meta perspective. It's a fun new way to look at the world building and to look at the story that we love so much. It's what makes like playability of Final Fantasy XIV so fun as well. So if nothing else, I hope that you have come away from the panel today with a healthy attitude of I want to learn more and asking questions in new ways, because that's part of the fun of this.
Mm-hmm. And I also just think fishing is fun. So there is that.
That is true. I in my brief stint as a fisher, because my chosen end game content is raiding, uh, I did have a very good time finishing up the Feast of Fate quest.
But
I have done that at least.
so I'm not seeing any questions. So if anyone does have questions in the future, you are welcome to just drop them in the comments below, and either I will answer them or I will send it over to M, and M or I will answer for you. But I guess then, thank you everyone for watching our panel. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things. I hope you, if you didn't learn a few things, I hope you were at least entertained. And until the next time we do one of these, I hope you all have a wonderful day, week, month, whatever time frame that you want.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.